We will be joined live from Libya in just a moment by NBC's Richard Engel, who's been doing some amazing reporting from the war zone there. Are we allowed to call it a war zone? War zone. Let's call it a war zone. While interviewing Libyan rebels on the front lines in Libya earlier today, Richard and his crew found themselves on the wrong side of what I think was an artillery barrage. That is to say, they were not far away from it and covering it from a safe distance. They were right in the middle of it. Richard and his crew are fine. We will have that amazing footage for you in just a moment. And as I say, Richard will join us live. But put yourself in Richard Engel's shoes for a moment. If you had the job of being NBC's chief foreign correspondent, and let's say, like him, you speak Arabic and your special area of expertise is the Middle East, it's hard to imagine at this point when you get to come home, isn't it? I mean, the uprisings in Tunisia that began just 4 months ago continue to ricochet and swell throughout North Africa and the Middle East, in countries like Bahrain and Yemen and Syria and, of course, now Libya. But as our country tries to get our American heads around not only what's happening in the Middle East, but also our relationship to it as Americans, the great American awkwardness at the heart of all of this is how close the United States is and how supportive the United States has been to all of the leaders who are now getting overthrown by their own people, or where their people are at least trying it. From the Tunisian government that was the first to fall, which the U.S. maintained very good relations with, to Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, the great U.S. ally of 3 decades, to even the leader who's teetering on the brink in Yemen now because of U.S. worries about al-Qaeda and extremism in his part of the world. He is supposedly our great ally against terrorism. Even Muammar Gaddafi. Most Americans, if they think of him at all, think of him as a ridiculous cartoon villain. But even he has recently been considered an ostensible American ally. Gaddafi, who accepted Libyan responsibility for the Lockerbie bombing, whose planes the United States military shot down in 1986, a man whose house Ronald Reagan shot a missile at during that campaign. Even Gaddafi was brought in from the cold, as they say, and made into a supposed U.S. ally by the George W. Bush administration when they were searching for something to call a diplomatic victory after the fiasco that was the fake weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. It is hard enough to figure out how Americans can best help out popular uprisings of people who want to determine their own future instead of living under a despot. That is hard enough. How do you figure that out when the despot in question is our despot, when his despotic regime has enjoyed American support, an American seal of approval? That's why there was this collective national stomach churning when we started to see images of those made in the USA tear gas canisters that were fired at the peaceful protesters in Egypt. The Egyptian military first stayed neutral and then sided against Mubarak in Egypt. But had they not, had Mubarak kept control of the military, ultimately it wouldn't have just been tear gas. It would have been American Abrams tanks and American F-16 fighter jets squaring off against that peaceful protest movement that America was supporting. In Libya right now, there is some of that very same awkwardness. Justin Elliott had a piece about this at Salon.com today that was really helpful and interesting. He's noting that the George W. Bush administration's embrace of Gaddafi and Gaddafi's military resulted in a big U.S. junket a year and a half ago that brought senior Libyan military officers to the headquarters of AFRICOM, to the headquarters of the U.S. Pentagon Command Center that is currently leading the fight against that exact same Libyan military. So think about that for a second. The upper echelons of the Libyan military got to tour the headquarters and see all the behind-the-scenes action at the Pentagon division that is now fighting them in a war. And it is looking more and more like a war. The UN Security Council vote that authorized the intervention that's happening right now, that vote was to protect Libyan civilians by enforcing a no-fly zone over the country, right? But it did also authorize member states taking, quote, all necessary measures to protect civilians there. We are now into that all necessary measures part. Reports from Libya indicating there is no one other than the coalition flying over Libya at all. The no-fly zone is essentially in effect over the entire country. Only coalition aircraft are in Libyan skies. But what those coalition aircraft are doing is attacking Gaddafi's military on the ground, attacking tanks, attacking missile launchers, attacking military ground forces.
Our targeting priorities are mechanized forces, artillery, those mobile surface-to-air missile sites, interdicting their lines of communications which supply their beans and their bullets, their command and control, and any opportunities for sustainment of that activity.
So to be clear, what is happening in Libya includes enforcing that no-fly zone. But it also is a lot more than that. It also includes essentially a U.S.-led international war on Gaddafi's military. And the U.S. leadership part of it, the American government keeps saying, the U.S. leadership part of it will end very soon. That's what President Obama, for example, told Univision last night when he was asked about his exit strategy in Libya.
The exit strategy will be executed this week in the sense that we will be pulling back from our much more active efforts to shape the environment.
This week, says President Obama. Mr. Obama's Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, reading from the same page.
It will be 1 week on Saturday. Will it happen by Saturday?
Well, it will be days. Whether it's by Saturday or not depends upon the evaluation made by our military commanders along with our allies and partners.
This repeated insistence that the U.S. is not going to lead this thing. It doesn't just have an international audience. It is not just about telling the Muslim world, for example, that America isn't leading this charge. It is not just about telling American allies in this intervention that they better step up, that U.S. forces are not going to lead it forever. This repeated assertion that the U.S. is going to pull back also has a domestic audience, and frankly, a legal one. The idea that Libya is a limited intervention, an intervention that's only going to take a matter of days, that isn't going to be a sustained American-led effort, that is key to the Obama administration's justification for not getting authorization from Congress for doing what they're doing. As Charlie Savage noted in the New York Times this week, the Obama administration appears to be operating on the theory that the Libyan intervention falls short of what would prompt any necessary congressional authority. Walter Dellinger, former head of the Office of Legal Counsel and acting Solicitor General, making the same case, that under the War Powers Resolution, the president can take military action without first getting authorization from Congress if U.S. involvement is expected to be limited in its expected nature, scope, and duration. So think about this. This is where we are. We have a president who does not want the U.S. to be seen as stomping into another Muslim country. We have the repeated promises that the U.S. is not going to be running this thing for much longer, the way that we have been for the past few days. We have a president who has proceeded to this military action by a procedural means that essentially requires the mission to be limited in its duration and its scope. And we have no clear indication of who takes over from the U.S. if the U.S. does really get out of the lead. The U.S. and Britain clearly want NATO to take over. France, on the other hand, keeps saying they don't want that, and they are going to invent some sort of committee or something to run it instead. At this point, who knows? Could be NATO, could not. The very first NATO combat mission ever took place in 1994. It came after the UN authorized a no-fly zone over Bosnia. In February 1994, in support of that UN resolution, NATO shot down 4 Serbian jets that had violated the no-fly zone. That was the first combat action that NATO took as an alliance in its history. After shooting down those jets, there was a targeted NATO bombing campaign that U.S. air forces were involved in. An American fighter pilot named Scott O'Grady was shot down over Bosnia during that mission. He survived for 6 days on the ground alone before he was rescued by U.S. forces. But then what had been a limited engagement in Bosnia, a no ground troops engagement there, broke open in the summer of 1995 when in Srebrenica, 8,000 men and boys were massacred by Bosnian Serb forces, just their wives and their daughters left behind. What NATO had been doing up to that point was judged after Srebrenica to be not enough. The bombing campaign was then stepped up massively. It was a NATO effort, but one in which the U.S. took the lead role.
Though it is officially a NATO operation, American air power dominates the raids. More than 200 Allied sorties so far. The warplanes flew this corridor across Bosnia into the heart of Sarajevo, knocking out Serb air defenses first, then bombing Serb targets near the city.
That sustained bombing campaign went on for weeks and weeks. It ultimately forced the Dayton Peace Accords in November of that same year. Then afterwards, to enforce those peace accords, even though President Clinton had promised there would be no U.S. ground troops involved there, in the end, there were.
They ask for America's help as they implement this peace agreement. America has a responsibility to answer that request, to help to turn this moment of hope into an enduring reality. To do that, troops from our country and around the world would go into Bosnia to give them the confidence and support they need to implement their peace plan. I refuse to send American troops to fight a war in Bosnia, but I believe we must help to secure the Bosnian peace.
What started as the first NATO combat mission ended up with 20,000 U.S. troops on the ground there. It's not to debate the merits of what the United States did in Bosnia. It's not even to debate the merits right now of what the U.S. is doing in Libya. But this is the open question in front of the country right now. The question of tactically whether it is possible for the U.S. to be involved in an international mission like this in a way that is limited, that is short-term, one in which the U.S. is a participant and not a prime mover. That is what President Obama says he wants. That is the grounds on which he has proceeded to this without getting authorization from Congress. That is what he says he wants. Is it possible? Richard Engel joins us live from the thick of things in Libya next.